I think this was a cover-up of momentous proportions. I think it was even bigger than the Watergate cover-up.
Let's move on to talk about Joe Biden, because the former US president has revealed he's suffering from an aggressive form of prostate cancer. It's spread to his bones. The situation with his health obviously has been, is now very serious, but there's been some pretty big questions about his health in the final days, maybe even years of his presidency. Andrew, one of the things we've been talking about this morning, actually before we came on air, was how much the media in America were aware of how big a problem this was and how willing they were to, if not cover it up, at least not show it in all its in all of its devastating impact. What do you make of that accusation?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the prostate cancer isn't something that was covered up, as far as I'm aware. That this is a new development, and it does happen, particularly to males in their early 80s. It's one of the risks of life at that stage. And although it's been described as aggressive, I'm also understand from the American newspapers this morning that it is also treatable. So there may be some good news in that bad news. On the wider point about Mr. Biden's ability to govern and to continue to govern for another 4 years, I think this was a cover-up of momentous proportions. I think it was even bigger than the Watergate cover-up. And the reason I say that is that in the end, it was the media which exposed Watergate. We did our job, led, of course, by these two brilliant reporters of the Washington Post. Then everybody else piled in. And in many ways, it was the media that exposed what had gone on with Watergate and post-Watergate in the Nixon White House. Whereas in the case with Joe Biden, the media was complicit. 95% of the American media went along with the narrative that we were exaggerating how bad he was, how incapable he was of governing the country. It was just right-wing fake news. It wasn't true. I've seen him Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, the bloviator of morning television in the United States. He used the phrase, "I'm going to tell you the truth." And then he said, "F you," live on air. If you can't handle the truth, I've known Joe Biden for 40 years. This is Joe Biden at the best I've ever seen him. He said that about 6 weeks before the debate.
So why is this though?
So in a sense, because American journalism is now so tribal, overwhelmingly Democrat, that the Democrat tribe went along with the White House narrative and didn't do their job. They peddled propaganda and lies and are only now being held to account.
Is that because they were trying to respond to the other side of propaganda, that this polarization point, that because journalism is no longer trying to find out what's going on, it's trying to beat the other side into submission on either side of the ball? And an awful lot of conspiracies do come out of the right in America, which are untrue, and that presumably that it creates this environment, isn't it, where it's competing conspiracies, not a quest for the truth, it's to make your conspiracy win.
There's a lot of conspiracies come out of the right in America, and most of them are complete nonsense. But in this case, it was a conspiracy, and the stupidity of the American media in this was that they were denying what we could see by our very eyes. You didn't have to believe a conspiracy theory to see that Joe Biden was totally incapable of serving another 4 years in the White House. Indeed, there was a major doubt as to whether he could see out the remaining months that he had in the White House until the inauguration in January of this year. So it wasn't a conspiracy. They weren't trying to deny a conspiracy. They were trying to deny what any sensible person could see simply by watching Mr. Biden's performances in front of the television camera. And of course, we now know that in these new books that are coming out, that at this stage, as they were saying, that Mr. Biden was as sharp as a tack and the most acute and agile that they had ever seen him. There were discussions going on in the White House about whether he might not need a wheelchair for a second term. So we were lied to by people who were understandably terrified, understandably wanted to try and do anything to stop Donald Trump getting a second term. But in the end, that is not our job as the media. Our fundamental job as the media, otherwise we have no purpose. In a democracy, our fundamental job is to tell the truth. And in saying what they said about Joe Biden, they knew Not only were they not telling the truth, they knew they were not telling the truth.
It's a really interesting unfolding story, and of course incredibly unfortunate news from Joe Biden. But Andrew, as you say,
Terrible.
it does sound like it is incredibly treatable.
Since that announcement, you have seen Donald Trump come out and actually offer condolences to say that he wishes Joe Biden and his family the best. It does feel as though the political barbs, which are so often there, have been put aside, and lots of MAGA Republicans are now wishing Joe Biden the best, which I think gives you a sense of the severity potentially of Joe Biden's health, when we're normally, to your point, hearing all these barbs traded about Joe Biden's health and mental ability.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? Because one of the things that Donald Trump does very successfully, he likes to fight some things. He always wants to have an opponent. And when someone has got a serious illness, does that mean all bets are now off with Biden? He can't, in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, go back against Sleepy Joe, because that's in some ways how he defines himself. He defines himself against the previous administration, doesn't he?
He does. I mean, let's see obviously where this goes. I mean, ultimately, when we were hearing from the Biden camp about the state of Joe Biden's health, they said, it's an aggressive form. However, it's hormone sensitive. That means that could be effective management. I suspect if Joe Biden appears more healthy, Donald Trump will go back to trading barbs and going on the attack. But it will really depend in terms of where it goes. But one other interesting element is one of the really big stories in DC over the past couple of weeks has been Joe Biden's health, but not cancer. It's been about whether he was capable of being president near the end of his first term, and whether he should have been stopped from even going for the second term in the first place. Of course, eventually he pulled out after a disastrous debate. And there's a big book coming out. There's lots that have been trailed from this. And I suppose with this announcement on Joe Biden's health, is it going to be still the sense of an open season with Democrats
Yeah.
turning on Joe Biden, Republicans? I think that's probably a bit tricky now to go back to that when people are worried about how he's going to fare in the coming months.
It's an interesting point, that, because presumably people want to still have that conversation, don't they? They still want to and I know this book is making huge amounts of news, which is whether Democrats derelict in their duty. Was Biden derelict in his duty? Did he cling on when he was clearly too unhealthy? So how healthy or otherwise he was is an important thing for the Democrats to wrangle with, and the country as a whole.
Yes, and lots of people feel as though they have held off too long in having that conversation, and that conversation should have started over a year ago. And you will hear certainly Republicans, but some Democrats privately saying there was a bit of a conspiracy of silence, not just by Biden's inner circle, but parts of the media, when it came to covering the state of the president's health. And now you have a plethora of these books coming out. The Jake Tapper CNN book, of course, the most recent, but there have been books previously to that. So everyone now wants to talk about it. I suspect the conversation will keep happening. It might just perhaps be a little less brutal towards Joe Biden, because people will be taking into account the fact of this diagnosis.